A recent interview with Akutami Gege, Mando Kobayashi, and Fuji TV saw a lot being talked about regarding the manga for Jujutsu Kaisen. Some of the information that was discussed delves not only into the present but the future of the story. If you're an anime only watcher, I highly advise you to leave now before you get spoiled. Go get caught up to the most recent chapter of the manga and come back when you've done so. For those that are manga readers and are here to know exactly what my thoughts are on Gege's interview, let's dive into and see what came from the mind of the madman himself. These are my thoughts on Akutami Gege's interview about Jujutsu Kaisen. Let's go. Now, before we dive into the interview, I normally shout out the people who translate interviews or pieces that provide us with this kind of information. However, for personal reasons, I won't be doing so. Instead, I'll leave the link for the interview translations in a pinned comment in the comment section below. So with that out of the way, let's get straight into this interview. We start off with Nanami and that Gege thought that he would lose at least an arm in his fight against Mahito. Now, let's be honest with ourselves. This statement could be true before the events of Shibuya, and the plans that Gege had for Nanami might have been different than initially intended. However, what we saw happen in the fight against the Gon, well, there was no way he was walking out of Shibuya in one piece. I found it even more interesting that he already exceeded his time in the story by this point, so maybe Gege had planned on having him go out much earlier, but I'm glad that wasn't the case given what happened in Shibuya. The impact of his death wouldn't have resonated as much as it did with Yuji being there in that moment if it had happened a lot earlier in the story. Switching over to Todo now, Gege says that his character was basically inspired by Kenpachi from Bleach. He's named as such because it sounded like a strong name. You can definitely see the similarities between the two in battle with how brutal they come across in their combat styles. The key difference here that separates the two is that Todo's love for Takeda and idols, while Kenpachi just loves to fight. Nonetheless, it's cool to see the inspiration behind Todo, and given that Gege is a huge fan of Tite-Kubo and Bleach, I'm certain this won't be the last time we see someone from Bleach have more inspiration in the story for another character. Kobayashi then asks Gege what his type of woman is, and he goes on to say the feeling kind of fades as the years go by. Given that Gege and I share the same birthday, only being 2 years apart, is kind of spooky because in some ways that feeling resonates with me a lot, so I'm glad that I'm not the only one that has that kind of mindset. Although, to be honest with you, since the story continues to move forward, a tall woman with a big butt like Jennifer Lawrence sounds a lot better, so maybe we're not that alike after all. Now, this portion of the interview will definitely raise some eyebrows because we get information regarding Yuji's memory manipulation ability. The false memories that Todo and Choso experience aren't part of Yuji's abilities or any kind of technique. They aren't foreshadowing or reference to any technique. Todo and Choso see the memories that never existed for different reasons. I'm a little skeptical of this because if that's not the case, what the hell exactly is it that these moments happen whenever Yuji's involved that mess with their memories? For now, I'm just going to take this with a grain of salt and wait for Gege to properly explain things in the manga whenever we get there. It could be cap in what he says to mess with the readers, but given that Gege is a pretty new author in the industry, there might be some truth to these statements. One of Gege's favorite fights in the series is Panda vs Mechamaru from the Kyoto Goodwill event arc. While I enjoyed this exchange between the two, especially with how well Mappa handled in the anime, I feel that the best parts of what I took from their encounter were the gorilla mode and Panda's talk after the fight, the latter of which added more to Panda's character and how he understands Muta's situation because of his relationship with Okotsu. So it's nice to see that Gege enjoyed this fight quite a lot to be amongst his favorites thus far. Gege also hasn't decided on what Hanami's domain expansion will be like, but given what happened in Shibuya, well, it's not happening anytime soon, is it? Gege is pretty fond of chapter 46's color page with the cursed spirits all together in a family photo. He drew it but forgot that cursed spirits wouldn't show up in photos. Even though he might have forgotten that detail, I do think there's more to this photo now after hearing Jogo's talk with the Gon and Hanami before he perished at the hands of Sukuna about how they considered themselves as the real humans, and that this portrait might signify exactly how Jogo thought of himself and the group during their time together. We also won't have any reason to delve into characters with scars such as Utahime, Todo, and Mechamaru, as you're bound to get scars if you're a Jujutsu sorcerer, so there's no real meaning behind them. While I would like to see some of these characters' flashbacks in the case of Utahime and how she got hers, I don't mind at all that we never get to find out the reasons behind them. Gege then goes on to talk about how much he enjoyed the fight between Ketchizu and Ezo versus Yuji and Nobara. The other death paintings won't appear in the serialization because they are in special grades. Again, this is fine with me because at this point it really wouldn't do anything for the story just to have them there for the sake of having more people in the manga. We get to hear Gege talk about Ghetto a little bit and how he's a homage to Sensui from Yu Yu Hakusho, and Gege was was emotionally invested in Sensui, but couldn't bring himself to feel the same way when depicting Ghetto. I feel like Gege knew he couldn't make a carbon copy of Sensui through Ghetto, as it would take away the elements of what make Ghetto's character so great in the way that he's been created. Gege also says the scene with Ghetto speaking to Yuki was added because they didn't think Ghetto's conviction was convincing enough. He's definitely someone I want to talk about a lot more on the channel because the layers surrounding his character are quite intriguing and he's a favorite of mine. So I'm looking forward to discussing more about Ghetto and what makes him such a great character at a later date. Gege rules out any chance of Yuki Tsukumo being related to Yuji, as the lines under Yuki's eyes are just tear lines, eye bags, which aren't related to the ones under Yuji's eyes. Again, I'm perfectly fine with this because it allows Yuji to have that chance of dreaming about his ideal girl without him having to go down the Joseph Joestar route in his life. Gege says the things that we saw Toji do during the Star Plasma Vessel arc added a depth to Megumi's character. Again, I don't wish to dive too much here because there's another topic of discussion for a later date surrounding Toji. However, you can see it's going far back as the beginning of little inklings of Toji's influence on Megumi and how he goes about things. It might be something once Megumi learns about, he'll come to appreciate his father or maybe change his opinion about him. And to fast forward a little bit in the interview, Gege does plan on addressing Megumi and Toji again later in the story. Hopefully when that happens, it'll involve Sumiki and her mother, the latter of which that we've yet to meet, while also learning about what exactly happened to Megumi's real mother, since we know that he and Sumiki are step siblings due to Toji marrying Sumiki's mom. Given the fact that Sumiki has reawakened, we're due for a Fushiguro reunion sooner than later. Gege then goes on to talk about Gojo's business trip overseas before the Goodwill event was to go on to see Okotsu, and that there is a very good reason behind this trip. Now this has potential ramifications to what could occur later on in the story. We know of Gojo's current predicament and Okotsu's role in the story at the moment. Things could definitely change, and this gives me a glimmer of hope that Okotsu is not on the side of Jujutsu High. And if you've read chapter 140 by this point, you can definitely see that Okotsu might actually not be working with Jujutsu High after all. In regards to Nobara, Gege states that he was indecisive about including her perspective as a flashback until right before he had to submit it, and that he didn't think it would be right for Nobara to just thank Yuji, so he thought the line he gave her was a pretty good one. You know what else would be pretty good? Letting me know if Best Girl is alive, because Gege, I need answers now. As of this moment, Gege says that we still don't know her current status. She has no signs of life and is technically dead when Akari gets to her, but since she was barely dead, it'll depend on how exactly he's able to take care of her. I'm not entirely ruling it out, but for there to be a slim chance of her survival, to me is enough to say that she'll be in the clear. Arata and Akari Nita are in fact brother and sister, and there may be more about their connection in the story. I'm interested to learn more about them after Arata's proper debut in Shibuya and how exactly the full properties of his curse technique work, while also learning more about the Nita family if they're a lesser sorcerer family affiliated to anyone of significant value. Gege also plans on drawing Yuji's parents at some point in the story, and it'll involve Noritoshi Kamo and Choso. Given what happened in chapter 139 and the reaction that Yuji had to what Choso said about his father, it seems like we're going to find out some pretty major details surrounding our main protagonist and its ties to the most evil sorcerer in history. Sukuna's ending is still up in the air, whilst Gege has long since decided on Yuji's and Megumi's endings. For me, ideally, the conclusion of Sukuna's role in the story might involve him being vanquished at the hands of Yuji or Gojo, but the path of getting there is pretty complicated. We don't know if extracting Sukuna from Yuji will cause the latter to suffer from a reaction that could harm him in the process, so it's hard to say how we get there, but the solution shouldn't be too far away. And finally, we're getting news about Hakari. Gege says they'd like to unveil Hakari, but the way his technique works might not align with things and cause some outrage. It's connected to his name, which as far as we know, it means a feast which follows a ceremonial funeral or an important occasion. So unless there is a spin on his name to correlate with his curse technique, it might have something to do with food, a funeral / ritual, or something else entirely. Gege says he doesn't intend to introduce any of the 4th years of Jujutsu tech, since he doesn't think that they'll add much to the story. While I disagree with this notion that there is a role to play for them, with them possibly being involved with Tengen and the higher ups, this could be Gege's way of giving us false hopes so that we less expect these things to happen. Even though I rather them be kept as secrets, so when we get them in the manga, they feel more genuine and exciting. And last but not least is the most controversial portion of the interview, is the remaining length of the story. According to Gege, we're about halfway done with the manga, and that it's set to end within the next 2 years. That means at some point in 2023, based on Gege's words, Jujutsu Kaisen will be over. Now, I'll say this, it's only a rough estimate of what Gege has planned, and I've been through this before with Oda saying every single year we have 5 years left and One Piece is still here. It's understandable that Gege wants to ensure that Jujutsu Kaisen hasn't reached its peak and begins to wane as the story continues. Ending on a high note allows the manga to be recognized as an elite story that elevates itself with every passing arc. I don't believe Shibuya is the peak of Gege's writing and that he's capable of doing even better with what's to come. So this interview offered us some interesting info, details, some of which I would have preferred to learn about later in the story, but I guess Gege wants us to know this now, because if his estimation of the series conclusion is actually true, it's best to be honest with his readers rather than letting them on to thinking that we'll get some more surprises and then later on be disappointed. However, I have my doubts that Jujutsu Kaisen will end in 2023, especially depending on the status of Weekly Shonen Jump and the other series that are left in the magazine around that time. Jump circulation numbers with the magazine have been faltering every single year, and this could be a pretty huge blow for them to lose a series that could garner more readers to help them in the long term. For now, we have to take what was said in this interview with a grain of salt, at least for certain things, especially that Gege's editor would have had to been fine with what was being said out in the open. So some of this information might be true and some could actually be fabricated slightly to mess with the readers' minds. It would be a pretty big rookie mistake to reveal info like this out in the open, so for now, I'm keeping that in mind that the editor had to have had a final say on what was being discussed and what couldn't. Either way, it was good to hear from Gege Sensei and the inner workings of his mind regarding his up and coming masterpiece. But let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below in regards to this interview with Akutami Gege. Do you feel like there was too much information that was being discussed in here? Do you feel like he's fabricating some of this information slightly, or is he actually being honest? Let me know how you felt about all the information that was talked about in here, and let me know how many years do you ideally see Jujutsu Kaisen going on for. Let me know all of that down in the comments below. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you guys are new here. If you want to be part of the weekly experience when it comes to my coverage of Jujutsu Kaisen week in and week out, subscribe if you haven't already, click on the bell Shandora to stay up to date with everything that goes on the channel, and with that being said, I will catch you guys in the next video. Commodore last signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, take care.